Hello, everyone. You're watching Vince by Submission. I want to put out my quick thoughts real quick on the Netflix card, MVP, Most Valuable Productions. There's been a lot of hype around this card. A lot of people are wondering, is this going to be an actual contender for UFC, the big juggernaut in the MMA space? And I watched the event, and there are some pros and cons, some stuff to consider whenever it comes to comparing them to UFC. So we're going to go through those real quick. So for starters, one of the big things I noticed is that their production quality was actually really good when it comes to like their camera angles and the camera quality. And they had like this red lighting thing going on, which at first I thought would be a bit of an eyesore. Red lighting is usually not as pleasing to the eye, but it was the right tone where it actually didn't seem too bad. And just the sound was good, and also there were no issues like we've seen before with ESPN and Paramount, where sometimes the apps would freeze up. I don't know if any of you watching this experienced that, but I've had a lot of issues with Paramount and ESPN when UFC was on ESPN. It would freeze up a whole lot. And on the Netflix stream, I guess they learned their lesson from whenever they did that boxing event that was a glitchy mess. It was good. It was solid. So that is probably the biggest strength I could give it, was the production quality is really good. Another thing I noticed that I really liked, they were doing a few things differently than what UFC does. So when you have two fighters getting ready to come out and they give you like the side by side displays of like, this is fighter A, this is fighter B, this is their their win loss record, their height, weight, age, reach advantage. They show you all that basic stuff. Netflix did something similar. They posted all that as well, but then they also show you what team they're with, what camp they're fighting out of, what their fighting style is. So if you didn't know who the fighter was, you could look at it and say, okay, well, he's with this team, so he trains with these people. He's a kickboxer, he's a wrestler. So you have like a little bit of an expectation if you don't know much about those fighters. And I actually thought that was pretty smart. And I kind of wish now UFC would actually do something like that. Yeah, that's like the main things I really thought were big standouts. Now, if we want to go over to all the negatives, this is where things are going to get a little, is this going to be really competition for the UFC or not? So, for starters, the biggest issue I think that we all saw and we all recognize is that the competition and like the fighter pool, the talent pool, is not nearly as deep as UFC is. Now you might be thinking, well, of course not. They're brand new. They have to build up. I get that. But they need to, at least with the talent they have, actually match them up properly. There were a lot of issues with matchmaking. So you don't get someone who's way, way, way better than someone else to put them against someone that's an easy win or something like that, where it's complete blowout fights, because that's mostly what we saw. And it was just not as entertaining to watch. I mean, if we go through these events one by one, or these matches one by one, you look here, you have this guy who looked a lot like Kevin Randleman whenever he was in the cage, going against Junior Dos Santos, who should have retired a long time ago, who's had a very terrible run at things, and knocks him out in brutal fashion. If this is supposed to be a dangerous opponent, why are you putting him up against someone? Look, and I'm one of the biggest Junior Dos Santos fans on the planet, but he is a shell of his former self. And if you're trying to show us the best fights, the last thing you want to do is get someone who could be a potential good up-and-coming fighter and then just have them murk someone who used to be good but not anymore. That seems to be what MVP is banking on, is just getting old talent that doesn't have the talent anymore and just pay them to go lose a match to try to build up other people. And I don't really think that's the best business model. This was actually a decent fight here. All of these fights on the main card, I didn't go through the prelims, but all of them were finishes. And while people might like seeing more finishes, whenever you have a whole bunch of them that are ending very quickly, a lot of it's because it's just a bunch of mismatches. And in the UFC, you don't really see that as much. You actually see competitive matches. And if I'm tuning in for MMA, I want to see competitive matches. That's not what we saw here. You have Lens, who was a very mediocre light heavyweight, going against probably the most dangerous heavyweight of all time, if not at the very least most dangerous heavyweight today. Squash match. these two, as fun as this fight was, and this is probably the most fun fight on the main card, these are guys who were good in MMA, but they weren't like top contender worthy. And on top of that, they're way past their primes now. So when we watch them fight today, like, is that really something really worth being impressed about? It was a great fight, but Nate Diaz just got battered. Mike Perry at least had more experience lately because of his bare knuckle boxing run. Nate Diaz, I don't really think has been active at all. So this is probably the least mismatch fight, and it would still look like a mismatch. And then, of course, you got coming off of a fight after, 10-year break and then a 17-year break. And even in their primes, it's clear that Rousey is leaps and bounds above Carano. So, again, they're just pulling out old talent that they could pay to get some attention. It's not legitimate competition, at least not in my eyes. And I think that's going to be the overall biggest issue with MVP. Now, again, you might be saying, well, this is just them getting started. They're going to be recruiting more people. They can be building some other people up. Sure, if the pay is going to be there, if the pay is going to be competitive against the UFC. But right now, that's not what I'm seeing. I am seeing them pulling in whatever desperate talent they can and putting on very mediocre events. I was not very impressed with it. So let's talk about the fighter pay. That's the big thing that Jake Paul and MVP, Most Valuable Promotions, whenever they're talking about we're going to be taking over UFC, they did a whole lot of, leading up to the event, during the event, and in the after event, taking a lot of pop shots at UFC. And if that's what they want to do, like if they want to come out and say like we are competition for UFC, I get it. But at least deliver on those promises. So the biggest thing they're talking about, the reason why we're going to be so much better than UFC, is you always hear these fighters complaining about fighter pay being not that good unless you're like a main eventer. Fighter pay is not nearly as good, so we're going to be paying our people way more than UFC will ever pay them. So we're going to have people wanting to jump ship come over to us because the pay is going to be so much better. Okay, let's look at that. So here's the pay for Rousey and Carano, the event. 2.2 million, 1.05 million, then you're in the 100,000s range here. You got 1.5 million here, and then 100,000, 400,000 and 500,000, and then you're looking at 70, 50, 80, 50,000, This pay was not nearly what I expected with all of the talk that Jake Paul did and MVP, the other people involved with the event. So like if you take these numbers and put them side by side with UFC 328, the most recent UFC numbered event, I'm still going to call them pay-per-views from time to time. So this is the last numbered event for UFC. And I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. Is MVP really going to be paying more than UFC does? Because according to what we're seeing right here on my screen, that's not the case. So if their whole big thing was we're going to be paying more than the UFC does, and we're going to be pulling in a bunch more talent because of that, I just don't see that happening with these numbers. Now, to clarify, I'm not some like diehard UFC fanboy that wants to protect them at all costs and don't want anyone to watch anything else. That's not what I'm saying. I watch a lot of other MMA promotions as well. I really like ONE FC. But if you're going to try to compete with the UFC, you're going to talk all this trash about the UFC, you want to try to be a competitor to them, you need to deliver on your promises. You need to at the very least, give us something we don't see in an MMA promotion. Like ONE FC, for example, will give us, fights from different styles. So you have like Muay Thai fights and Jiu-Jitsu fights, like where it's purely those other arts mixed in with MMA. So they have like a little special thing that they do. And, maybe MVP can do this down the road because I know they do boxing and whatnot. But the big thing they were talking about was the fighter pay. They're going to have much better talent. And right now, that's just not what I'm seeing. So some other issues I saw with this event, Ariel Helwani, enough said. And then another thing that a lot of people pointed out was their cage is smaller. So it's a hexagon instead of an octagon. And It was a lot smaller, and to me, that just when I'm watching it and I'm looking at the cage size, whenever it's that much smaller, it almost makes it feel like I'm watching amateur fights. I go to a lot of amateur MMA events in the local area, and their cages are a lot smaller. And so whenever I was watching this event on Netflix and it looked a lot smaller, it felt like I was watching like an amateur fight. Smaller cages tend to benefit pressure fighters and grapplers a lot more. So if you are a fighter who's a stick and move counter striker, you like mobility, this cage is not going to benefit you very well. So that might turn off some, potential high level, strikers that are looking at maybe a UFC alternative. That might not work out well for them. So yeah, that's basically it. Another issue I saw was the prelims were not even televised on Netflix. So whenever I tune into UFC, when it was on ESPN, I want to watch prelims, they're all there on ESPN. If I'm watching now that they're on Paramount, if I want to watch the prelims, and I usually try to at least watch some of them, they're all on Paramount. Netflix didn't have the prelims, so you have to tune over to YouTube or some other app to watch the prelims, then switch over to Netflix. Why can't you have them all on one streaming service instead of having to bounce back and forth? So that was also a problem I saw. So anyway, that's my quick thoughts on the event. There were some pros, there were some cons. It seems like a lot of people overall liked the event. I think mostly because it was something new and the production quality really was pretty solid. But for now, I'm not super impressed. Whenever I'm tuning in to watch MMA, I'm tuning in to see the best versus the best, and that's just not what I saw here. So hopefully they could, stack their roster a bit better, start paying out a bit better, start giving us actual good competitive matches where you don't really know who's going to win, with some names that are not just famous because of what they used to be, but famous because they're really good. They're big stars right now. The only big name they have that's relevant now is Francis Ngannou. So I hope they build up, because if they give the UFC competition, then that's just going to make the UFC get better as well. And if they don't, then they can overtake it. It's one of those situations where competition breeds just better products for the consumer on all ends. A rising tide raises all ships kind of thing. So anyway, that's my quick thoughts on the Netflix event. If you like what you see, like, subscribe, tell your friends, do all that fun stuff, and we'll continue putting out awesome content. So again, this was Vince by Submission, and we'll see you all next time.